Welcome back to another TSA video. This time we're looking at drawing conclusions, the second skill in the critical thinking section. So we've looked at identifying conclusions, which is where it says something like, what is the main conclusion that can be identified? Now we're looking wherever it says the word draw. Any time to draw a conclusion, we use this skill. So the main thing about identifying conclusions, what we did last time, was we knew that the conclusion was explicit in the argument. We knew it was going to basically be a quote from the argument. Drawing conclusions, the conclusion is not explicit in the argument, which basically means you need to come up with it yourself. And that's the only difference between this and the other skill, but it is quite a lot harder. So as I've written here, this differs from identifying conclusion because conclusion does not appear in the passage. You have to read the passage and try to summarize it in one sentence. How you do that, there's two ways you can do this. The first way is all of the sentences in the argument, so here, treat them as premises, as in they are trying to back up a conclusion, right? Every sentence here is trying to back up a conclusion. It's trying to lead to a conclusion. We know that conclusions rely on premises to stand. So all these sentences, which one of these conclusions, and E as well, are they backing up the most? And secondly, and basically my favourite method, we have the therefore test. The identified conclusions was when you're between two options, you should see which one leads to another. This time, put therefore in front of each of the options and see if, when you stick that at the end of the paragraph, if it makes sense, right? So you'll read the whole paragraph and then you'll go, therefore, so say I read all this, no one can yet be certain if these guidelines accurately affect the level of risk. Therefore, people who use mobile phones putting their health at risk, and you go through each option and you see which one makes the most sense. But you can see this is maybe slightly of a less foolproof method than skill 1, identify conclusions, but it should still work 95% of the time. And the third point, still remember that the arguments backing up the conclusion must still be in the passage, even if the conclusion itself isn't. So these options are not going to be in the passage, okay? But the arguments backing them up will. So if there is a conclusion here which is totally irrelevant to the paragraph, you can still rule out straight away. Okay? Let's have a go at 3 examples and see if we can put what I just said into practice. So again, you read the question first, and the question is, which of the following can be drawn as a conclusion, obviously. Okay, many people who live near to mobile phone masts are worried that radiation from these masts will damage their health. Mobile phones themselves have also been suspected of emitting dangerous levels of radiation, and a report recommended that children should be discouraged from making non-essential calls. Emission of radiation from the mast is much lower than that from a mobile phone. A few seconds making a phone call is comparable to 24 hours of exposure from a mast. Radiation from both of these sources is below the international guidelines as to what is a dangerous level, but no one can yet be certain if these guidelines accurately reflect the level of risk. We'll try the therefore test straight away. Therefore, people who use mobile phones are putting their health at risk. I mean, it seems to follow roughly, right? A seems to follow because it does talk about how bad making a phone call is compared to a mast, this, that, the other. So I'm not going to rule out yet. I'm going to keep it, but definitely still try all the options, especially for this type of question. This is definitely one of the hardest skills, I think. B, therefore, the international guidelines underestimate the risk to health from low levels of radiation. Well, that's not what it's getting at all, because it's looked at mobile phones for a large part of it, and it's compared them to the mast, and it's talking about radiation from both sources throughout the whole argument. It doesn't focus that much on the international guidelines, and this option here doesn't talk about mobile phones or the mast, so we can definitely rule that one out. C, the health risk from living near a phone mast is lower than that from using a mobile phone. So it definitely says that. It definitely says that. But remember, the conclusion is not explicit. Is that the overarching conclusion of the paragraph? No, it's actually a premise. That is what is being used to back up what the conclusion is, because it's saying something like, there are radiation from both these sources, but no one can yet be certain if these guidelines actually affect the level of risk. And so effectively, because emission from Mars is much lower than that of mobile phones, we shouldn't worry too much. This is a premise, not a conclusion, so we can rule that out too. D, people who live near mobile phone masts overestimate the risk to their health from these masts. It doesn't, that's again, it's not the conclusion. It doesn't say anything about how people feel about it. it's not like every sentence in this paragraph accurately links to D. If you put therefore people who live near mobile, radiation from both these sources below the international guidelines as towards a dangerous level, but no one can yet be certain these guidelines accurately affect the level of risk. Therefore, people who live near mobile phone masts overestimate the risk to their health from these masts. But that doesn't follow at all. This is almost totally irrelevant, so we can rule that out too. And E, therefore, if extensive use of mobile phones is not harmful to health, radiation from a mast is unlikely to be a risk. Well, that does seem to be what it's getting at, so we seem to be between two. Slightly harder to distinguish between two for this skill. Really, sort of just got to read it again and see what you end up with. But if I go from the middle, emission of radiation from the mast is much lower than that of a mobile phone. A few seconds making a phone call is comparable to 24 hours of exposure from a mast. Radiation from both these sources is below the international guidelines as what's a dangerous level, but no one can yet be certain if these guidelines accurately affect the level of risk. Therefore, people who use mobile phones are putting their health at risk. Well, again, the paragraph doesn't actually seem to be getting at that. It's not saying that mobile phones put people's health at risk. What it's actually saying is people shouldn't worry as much about radiation because radiation from both the sources are below the international guidelines, so there's no need to worry. This conclusion therefore doesn't follow. It doesn't follow every premise here. Whereas if I said, therefore, if extensive use of mobile phones is not harmful to health, radiation from mobile phones is unlikely to be a risk, this works the best out of the five because multiple reasons. First of all, it has this conditional if. If extensive use of mobile phones is not harmful to health. The paragraph at no point says that mobile phones are or are not harmful to health. Using mobile phones are or are not harmful to health. So the conditional is good in this case. Usually they're not brilliant, but it's good in this case because it matches the tone of uncertainty that the argument holds. But it definitely does say that radiation from a mast is unlikely to be a risk if the mobile phone is not harmful, because both of the sources are below the international guidelines and they're being compared throughout the argument. So E there is the best bet, but it's actually quite a difficult question, and you can see why it's a much harder skill than the first. Let's do another. Again, the question is what can be drawn, but we know that. The funding of the BBC through a universal licensing system is considered by many to be outdated and unfair. There seem to be only a limited number of options for the continued funding of this public broadcasting network. Firstly, the licence fee system could continue as at present. Secondly, the BBC could raise its own revenue as a commercial company through advertising and sponsorship. Finally, the BBC could be paid for, like other parts of the public sector, through general taxation. This almost is all totally irrelevant because all it's doing is discussing various options, it's giving you a load of facts, but there's no actual argument of substance at the moment, there's no premises yet, so we're going to see what the second bit says. Funding of the BBC through taxation may raise questions about the BBC's independence from government. This independence might also be put at risk if the BBC had to operate as a commercial company. It might be unduly influenced by its advertising and sponsorship customers unless serious safeguards are put in place. So as you can see, there's no explicit conclusion here. It's almost like an unfinished argument. So we have to finish the argument by picking the correct conclusion. This is all just a bunch of premises. We need to finish the argument. So, therefore, there is no alternative to the license fee. These are the sort of ones you need to rule out straight away because it is affirmatively saying there is no alternative. That's it, argument done. That does not match the tone of the argument at all because here it's actually going through all the options. Going, firstly, we could do this. Secondly, we could do this. Finally, we could do this. It suggests that there's many different options, including the license fee system continuing. It is not saying there's absolutely no alternative to the license fee. It is saying the license fee could continue, or we could do this, or we could do this. There's all these different things we could do. It doesn't match the tone of the paragraph at all. It's too affirmative. We can rule that out. B, the independence of the BBC is inevitably at risk. Again, it's too affirmative. It is inevitably at risk. What it actually says is funding of the BBC through taxation, if it were to happen, because this has not happened yet, may, also a conditional, raise questions. So there's no certainty at all there. And it's also just not what the paragraph's getting at. The paragraph is looking at the different systems BBC could use to be funded. It's nothing really to do with the independence as much. The independence is important to pick which funding option, but that's not what the paragraph's getting at. The paragraph is getting at which funding option we should pick rather than anything about the BBC's independence. C, although not perfect, the license fee is the best option. This is more tentative because it at least admits that it's not perfect, and clearly the argument is saying that it's not perfect, so it roughly matches the tone. Would it work? So something like this independence might also be put at risk if the BBC had to operate as a commercial company. It might be unduly influenced by its advertising and sponsorship customers unless serious safeguards put in place. Therefore, although not perfect, the license fee is the best option. That does seem to work. I'm going to put little ticks, it works nicely. Because what this bit is getting at is we've talked through the options, but now we're actually criticising the other options that are not the licence fee. And so we are saying, although we've acknowledged the licence fee isn't perfect, it looks like the best option. So this looks good. D, therefore, general taxation will not be sufficient in raising revenues the licence fee. It's not to do with efficiency of raising revenue, though. It was the drawback of general taxation was not that it's not sufficient. It's to do with its independence here. So we can rule that out. And E, there might duties with advertising sponsorship customers unless serious safeguards put in place. Therefore, commercial advertising on the BBC will damage the revenue prospect of the commercial broadcasters. Again, it's not quite right because that's the premise as well. That is discussing the different types of options, which is done up here. It mirrors that, but it's not the conclusion. The conclusion, it is definitely the one that best fits if you put therefore in front of it is C, because it totally matches the tone of the paragraph or paragraphs, whereas the others, yeah, this is about the license fee. What it's doing is it's talking about the license fee, it's giving other options and then saying those options are bad, therefore the license fee is the best option, even if it's not perfect. That's the perfect match there. So that is the conclusion that can be drawn. I'll do one more. People are attracted to cities because of the job opportunities that they bring. At the same time, house prices tend to push people away from urban centres. The draw of healthy living and green environments similarly pulls people towards less urban environments, further from city centres. The limiting factor is in suburban spread. The expansion of cities beyond their existing boundaries is often travel time by either public or private means. One of the appeals of driverless cars is that they are set to cut delays of up to 40% because they switch lanes more efficiently, drive closer to the vehicle in front, and travel at a constant speed without repeatedly braking and accelerating, which is the main cause of congestion. Therefore, we can expect some cities to expand beyond their current limits as a result of driverless cars. That looks promising because it talks about the limiting factor is suburban spread. We need to basically expand cities, and so we can expect some cities to expand. So that seems to work, but we'll go to the others. B, therefore, there will no longer be any limits to suburban spread with the introduction of driverless cars. That's not what it's saying, because it talks about driverless cars, and then it says one of the appeals of driverless cars is that they cut delays because they switch lanes more efficiently, which is the main cause of congestion. But it's talking about how we can beat this limiting factor. It doesn't say anything about that there will not be any limits. It's still too affirmative, as we discussed before. C, the attractions surrounding city centres will disappear once people have access to driverless car. Again, that's definitely not what it's getting at. It's still too affirmative, and it doesn't really link to the paragraph. D, therefore, the introduction of driverless cars could mean that there are no longer any green spaces people enjoy. Again, not really. It only talks about green environments up here and then just stops. So it's not like every sentence draws up to that conclusion. And E, therefore, there will be more people living in suburban environments than city centres after the introduction of driverless cars. Interesting, but no. And it's no because it's not actually talking about where people live. Rather, it's talking about why people are attracted to cities, why they can't get there, and what the limiting factor is. The electric cars bit is almost giving a reason why that will be mitigated, but the conclusion is not that people are going to move, the conclusion is that cities are going to expand. I think that's the difference. So that is all I've got for drawing conclusions. I'll make another video soon on the next part of critical thinking, but hopefully that helps. See you in the next video.